Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast, a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today.
Welcome to GSMC, America's Still Beautiful podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Alyssa Jo. Hello. How are you doing today? I hope you're having a wonderful day so far and a wonderful week. Can you believe it is already like the end of June? My mind is blown. For me, this year has gone by so quickly already, and I know it's been chaotic this entire year, and I think maybe that's part of the reason why it's going by quickly, because there's just so much. You kind of lose track of time because every single day is like so much information and so many things going on. I forget to just look at the calendar and realize, holy crap, it is near the end of June. It's the summer now, which is exciting, right? The weather is going to be good, and I am just mind blown with time these days. But I guess it's a good thing. I guess that means I've been busy and going after it. So I hope you have been too. I hope time is moving fast, but in a good way, because we want to enjoy every moment that we can. Well, amidst all of this chaos and craziness that's been happening in 2020, there's also been some amazing things happening as well. And you know that I am here to tell you all of those amazing things that happen. I am your feel-good, positive vibe type of girl. This podcast is just meant to bring you feel-good emotions and positivity and hopefully uplift your day, because that's exactly what I want to do here. So I really hope that it does. Now, I will stop rambling on. Let's get into today's episode. I have some pretty awesome stories. I got some stuff about the coronavirus, all positive things, though, I promise. I have some really cool things that some young kids have done that's going to make a huge change. Some animal stories for you animal lovers out there. And I have a pretty cool survey that I want to share with you guys, but that's going to come at the end of the episode. It's all about kindness. You're not going to want to miss it. But let's start off today's episode with a story about a coronavirus breakthrough. The best kind of coronavirus story, right? So there was a breakthrough of a cheap and a very widely accessible used drug that has found to cut deaths by 1/3. Crazy, right? So, of course, we've just been trying to prevent the coronavirus, and we've been taking all those measures to, make sure we're staying at home and wearing masks and gloves and all those things that we need to do to help prevent coronavirus from spreading. And, of course, testing has saved many lives. But now there's been no life-saving treatments for respiratory complications from the virus, but there is now. So let's get into this. So researchers at the Oxford University, this is in the UK, they just announced that a low-dose steroid treatment, it costs about $6 per dose, and it's widely available. And it can actually reduce the risk of death by 1/3 for patients on ventilators and by 1/5 for those on oxygen. What an awesome breakthrough, right? So doctors typically use the drug. It's called dexamethasone. It's to reduce inflammation in their patients, usually. So it's an effective treatment for a wide range of different conditions, asthma, arthritis, even some skin problems, I guess. So it actually seems to help coronavirus patients by reducing the damage of cytokine storms, which is a condition where the immune system goes into overdrive and attacks healthy tissues as it tries to fight the virus. So they're saying that it's called the recovery trial. So randomized evaluation of COVID-19 therapy. And so this is a study which has involved 175 hospitals across all of the UK. And they found no outstanding adverse events from the 10-day treatment given to over 2,000 patients in this randomized trial over about 6,400 infected patients. So this treatment can be given pretty much to anyone, they say, and it can be used immediately to save lives worldwide. How cool is this? So there was no benefit among those patients who tested positive for the coronavirus, but they did not require respiratory support. So this life-saving breakthrough is just the latest kind of good medical news for those who are suffering from COVID-19. But they also are saying that the antiviral drug remdesivir has also recently been shown to reduce the duration of symptoms from 15 to 11 days. So I want to start today's episode off with a little bit of good news. That way there are things that are coming up. I have mentioned remdesivir on this podcast before when that first came out. But now there's another one. And it's $6 per dose, and it's widely available. So I think that just gives me hope, and I hope it gives you hope. Now, speaking of positive coronavirus news, I have a pretty cool story about a Tennessee scientist, and he was, definitely well respected as a scientist, but not very many people heard of him until coronavirus kind of put him in the spotlight. His name is Dr. Peter Tsai, and I don't know if you know that name or not, but believe it or not, he's the creator of the filter material inside most disposable N95 respirators, which is pretty cool. So, as the pandemic worsened and healthcare workers, really needed to stay safe and have those masks, there were a lot of shortages, as we all know, and people are trying to do what they can to help out with that. But Dr. Tsai came out of his retirement and he decided to dive headfirst into solving this crisis. So since mid-March, he's actually been a worldwide force on two different fronts. So finding new ways to sterilize disposable respirators for reuse and also rapidly scaling up their production. So he says, my invention is just an ordinary invention. He's quite the humble guy, but he says, but because of the need of the respirators, people think it is very important. So, his invention's not new. He actually filed the first patent for the filtration technology back in 1995. And his invention gives the mask's filter fabric a permanent electrostatic charge by exposing it to a halo of electricity. So scientists call this as an electoral corona, and he named his process coronal charging. So kind of coincidence between the names. He says, I use coronal charging to fight coronavirus. Pretty funny. But he's had a long career in textile manufacturing and engineering. He actually graduated for what is now the National Tapai University of Technology in 1975. And he worked for several years in manufacturing before moving to the United States. This was back in the 1980s. And yeah, so then he was getting some materials in science at the University of Kansas back then. So during his research career at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, he developed the filtration technology further while pursuing some other projects as well. He actually holds 12 U.S. patents in filtration technology and some other areas. Pretty incredible person. So his material and production process made a huge difference in the world, but it just wasn't front page news. And he retired late of 2019. And then, of course, we know what happened this year. He came back out of retirement to help out where he could. So he says he knew the kinds of stress that the respirators could tolerate, and he published some of his thoughts in the Journal of Emergency Medicine in a special emergency article, and he turned his home into a lab and started to publish more results. So one group donated an ozone machine commonly used in hospital sterilization to see if that would work. He boiled and steamed masks. He borrowed a neighbor's oven to see if the mask could be safely heated using common kitchen appliances. He exposed respirators to sunlight. The masks were then tested again to see if they lost filtration power. So ozone was a no-go because it ruined elastic or rubber ear loops. Wet heat had to be applied carefully to avoid deforming of the mask. The home ovens heated too unevenly and accurately. Alcohol ruined the filters. Some other techniques like dry heat and hydrogen peroxide seemed a little bit more promising. So he couldn't fully test every technique, nor could he, validate that it killed the viruses. And so this kind of worried him. And he says, I started wondering whether people were using my methods without validation. If it does not really sterilize the mask and people reuse them, then we would have a lot of trouble. So he reached out to some other scientists and got in touch with a team at the University of Tennessee Medical Center to validate some of his approaches. And this big research group is called N95 DECON. They kind of all got in touch and they decided to run some tests to validate some of his suggestions, in addition to some other ones that they were doing. So N95 DECON recommends versions of some of Tasai's initial approaches for sterilization. Its validation studies cite communications with Dr. Tasai and the experiments of over 100 N95 DECON members. So their results kind of echo some Centers for Disease Control and Prevention suggestions for mass sterilization, but reusing masks is only kind of half the battle. So the world, of course, faces a critical supply shortage. Few domestic suppliers make 95 filtration material. Half the world's N95 masks are manufactured in China, and the Food and Drug Administration recently deauthorized any models of N95 masks from being reused. So eventually they were doing their scientific wonders, and with his expertise and the team at ORNLL, they were able to quickly convert its carbon fiber processing facility into a filtration cloth facility. So within a week, it was able to produce filtered cloth. Which they say it's impossible to say how much time Dr. Tasai's involvement actually saved. But he says, just imagine the amount of experiments you'd have to run to determine a process that works. That can average from months to years, but we didn't have to because he had already done all of the experiments. Pretty cool. So the ORNL facility can produce enough material for roughly about 9,000 masks per hour. So it's shipping the material to an academic and national labs for research purposes. So they worked with industry partners to get the fiber technology into domestic manufacturing's hands as quickly as possible. So Dr. Tasai said this was far from the only consulting work he had been doing. He said he'd been doing pro bono consulting work and research around the clock when all this stuff came up. So he says, this is just an opportunity for me to contribute to the community. If I can do this, it will be a good memory for the rest of my life. All right, it is time for a little bit of a break, but don't go anywhere. I have lots more feel-good, positive stories to share with you, so stay tuned.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to GSMC, America's Still Beautiful podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. All right, let's jump right back into it. I have so many more stories to share with you today. So this next one might be my favorite story of the entire episode today because there are some pretty unlikely heroes that you would not normally guess, but there are some unlikely heroes in Minneapolis that have raised $100,000 to support Black-owned businesses and neighborhoods. Guess who these unlikely heroes are? I'm not kidding when I say some 9-year-old kids. Yes, 9-year-old kids. So this all started one day when her name is Cameron Johnson and her 5 friends. They were just bored and they wanted to have some fun, so they decided to sell some bracelets. But rather than keep the money for themselves, Cameron's mom suggested it'd be nice to do something positive for others. So the kids agreed, and that's when Cameron and Friends Bracelets for Unity and Justice had began. So they hope to make a small impact with their enterprise. They just kind of started selling bracelets, but these children actually managed to raise almost $100,000. How crazy is that? This was just in time for Father's Day, and Cameron's dad said he is super proud. He says she made over $800 the first day. Crazy. He says that she had blisters on her fingers now, and she's been working so hard. So small business owners in Minneapolis have been hit hard in the recent months. Of course, the coronavirus pandemic shut down for more than a month, and then violence following the death of George Floyd resulted in damage and looting. So the money raised by Cameron and her friends will actually just deliver welcome aid to those trying to get back on their feet. So even the bracelets cost about $5, but people have gone, paid more than $5. They said anywhere from $20 to $50 or even $100 just to support the cause and get one of these bracelets. So in addition to selling the bracelets, each woven, they're all different colors and woven. They're kind of cute. They've collected online donations on a GoFundMe campaign, and so that was tallied about $46,000. So a portion of the money raised will go towards providing food and household supplies to those in need. Some of the beneficiaries include the Sanctuary Covenant Church Food Drive and the Kyle Rudolph Food and Supply Drive. But what her parents say that they are most proud of is that it lies beyond the world of good in his daughter and her friends that have done good for the local businesses and charities, but they've also managed to get people talking about things that matter, which is so true. So her father says, day after day, we're having impactful conversations with so many people. So many of our community members have come by to drop off supplies or just talk about things like racism and injustice, stuff that we don't talk about very often. So, yes, it just goes to show that even in times of adversity, we can all kind of make an impact and do our part to create a better world. Even children that are only 9 years old that are raising this amount of money, that is just so crazy, and it's so cool to see. So if you do want to go support that, you can search that up. You will see Cameron and Friends Bracelets for Unity and Justice, and they're still raising money, and they're just going to be going to help out good causes. So if you want to go be a part of that, head over there and you will find lots of information on that. Now, speaking of justice, there's a new Senate police reform bill, and it's looking to increase accountability and promote de-escalation training to rebuild lost trust, is what they are saying. So Senate Republicans they've now introduced a large bill of police reform, and it's called the Justice Act. It includes measures to improve reporting, increase penalties for officers that are falsifying police reports, offer funding for additional training programs in de-escalation and nonviolent policing, and to also create a new criminal justice commission that will continually make recommendations on how to reform every level of the criminal justice system with the citizens' safety and rights as the central consideration. Okay, so now this is kind of all in the wake that everything that's happened with George Floyd. And so now the state and now federal legislators have been listening to the petitions of millions of Americans asking for more police accountability, less violence in policing, fewer laws which create discriminatory policing, and so much more. So they are already kind of on the start at this. So I already mentioned about the introduction and the passage of the laws that were in both Colorado and in Kentucky that increase police accountability, and they also banned the no-knock police warrants. We talked about that in an earlier episode I mentioned, but now at the federal level, House Libertarian Justin Amash has introduced, along with Democratic support, is a bill that would roll back the doctrine of qualified immunity, which makes it extremely difficult for a private citizen to bring a police officer up on charges for rights violations. So this Justice Act goes quite a bit further than that. It's kind of in a little bit of a different direction. They say created by African-American Senator Tim Scott and 46 other co-sponsors from the right side of the aisle. The Justice Act is a large piece of police reform with an aim to improve and reform policing practices, accountability, and transparency. So Senator Scott says now is the time for reform. The murder of George Floyd and its aftermath made clear from sea to shining sea that action must be taken to rebuild lost trust between communities of color and law enforcement. So the Justice Act takes smart, common sense steps to address these issues, from ending the use of chokeholds and increasing the use of body-worn cameras to providing resources for police departments to better train officers and make stronger hiring decisions. All sounds pretty awesome, doesn't it? So here are some other major articles in the Justice Act I will share with you. So hiring and training. So one criticism of police accountability since the protests over George Floyd's death began has been kind of departments' reluctance to fire officers that are involved in deadly use of force situations with citizens, particularly as related to the killing of Breonna Taylor or Tamir Rice, where in both cases these officers that did the shooting are still in policing, or in other cases where officers are rehired in other departments. So to this end, the Justice Act has several different responses. The first is for the commission of the government database that is publicly accessible, containing the disciplinary record or internal investigation record that is regarding any law enforcement officer, to be held no less than 30 years and to be accessed and consulted before a hiring decision is made. As many other articles in the bill state, any government, state, local, or Native American tribe that receives policing funding from the federal government will be ineligible to receive further funds if the creation of such database be postponed or ignored. So there's so much more information just on that alone. They're also doing body cameras and holding police accountable. So also that's included in this bill are measures to enhance police accountability. So starting with the use of body cameras, cameras are going to be worn on the vest or body of police officers that have emerged as a potentially effective way of just enhancing the accountability among law enforcement officers, which is awesome. In Colorado, the use of body cameras was included in their new accountability legislation, with requirements that they would be switched on 5 seconds before and after interaction with a citizen in which policing may occur. So that no knock bill that we were talking about, that's what they were saying too, that you have to the police officers do have to turn on their cameras 5 seconds before and after any interaction happens at all. But at the top of the Justice Act, the George Floyd and Walter Scott and Breonna Taylor Notification Acts created a detailed, publicly accessible database of all incidents involving the use of deadly force during a confrontation with a citizen and while serving a no-knock police warrant. So they contained within will be the identity of the police officers involved, the date and time and reason for the event or warrant service, the citizens that were harmed or killed, their race, gender, income status, etc., all of those different things, and of course whether any warrants or procedure were correctly served. So information within the databases will be accessible to any Freedom of Information Act requests, providing that it doesn't involve details that may compromise ongoing criminal investigations. They're also doing the new National Criminal Justice Commission. So this is Title VII of the bill states, and it says, it is in the interest of the United States to establish a commission to undertake a comprehensive review of the criminal justice system. There has not been a comprehensive study since the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice was established in 1965. So, if passed, this Justice Act would see the creation of a National Criminal Justice Commission that would undertake a comprehensive review of all the areas of the criminal justice system, including the criminal justice costs, practices, and policies of the federal, state, local, and tribal governments. So there's so much more information involving this Justice Act. If you want to go search that up and check that out, I highly suggest you do so. I think it's going to make you feel good because there is lots of exciting and positive change coming our way. Now, it's time for another break, but don't go anywhere. When we get back, you know it, I have more feel-good stories with you, including that survey I want to share with you about some kindness, and you don't want to miss it. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to GSMC, America's Still Beautiful podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Alyssa Jo. Okay, we are on the last stretch here for today's episode, and I have a few more feel-good, positive stories to hopefully brighten up your day, so let's just jump right back into it. My next story is for all you animal lovers out there. The once extinct, or what we thought was the extinct Harlequin toad, has now been rediscovered by actually a Canadian scientist, which is pretty cool. So a researcher from New Brunswick has now rediscovered the species of the Harlequin toad that was once presumed as extinct. And the details of the discovery offer hope, not just for the species, but for the entire Harlequin genus, I guess, which was nearly wiped out by the amphibian epidemic. So, caused by bacteria, the fungal disease cytomycosis, or as they call it, the cytroid, has kind of wreaked havoc on the amphibians worldwide, and with the Harlequin toads proving particularly susceptible. So since this Canadian scientist, Melissa Costells, she had a site of the Harlequin toad in Ecuador, and this could mean that the epidemic of the cytrid may be subsiding, and then the evidence supporting, it's an already established and hopeful hypothesis, which is pretty cool. So she says the fact that it has reappeared after 30 years is possibly because they have become resistant to cytrid. So 13 of the 25 species of the Harlequin toads in Ecuador, the second most populous country for the species, have gone unseen by the scientists since the 1980s, which is absolutely crazy. So they're quite cute, these little guys. So they're green with a web-like design on the back, and the color of like spilled wine, they call it. So this toad has a white, yellow belly and jet black eyes, and it's encircled with shimmering gold irises. Honestly, such a beautiful toad, I have to admit. I'm not usually a toad person, but this guy's cute. So 10 of the 25 species are classified as critically endangered or possibly extinct, like this Harlequin toad, with another 14 critically endangered and on the IUCN Red List from the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So the exciting discovery of this toad is also the 9th such reoccurrence of a Harlequin toad species seemingly coming back to dead. So this is since 2003. So since making the discovery, that was just last August, the subsequent returns by her and her team to the Ecuadorian Reserve, and they yield about 5 times more toading sightings, including juvenile toads that were suggesting they are reproducing. So this is super, super exciting. So the cytrid is known to be present in the area. This is suggesting that the toads had either evolved a defense against the cytrid spores or simply gotten lucky and never came in contact with it. So of course there's still more research to come with that matter, but this is very hopeful, and they're saying that it's looking very positive for for all of the species, right? Not just this Harlequin toad, but for lots more. So stay tuned for that. I guess we will see what happens next. Now, tiny forests are starting to spring up all over Europe, all over the European countries. And this was actually inspired by Japan because they want to help restore biodiversity. So this is the same method of Japan's most famous forest. The European countries are beginning to dot their urban landscapes with tiny forests, which is as productive and biodiverse as any wilderness areas, yet sometimes only as big as a tennis court, which is pretty cool. So the idea is that volunteers can plant densely packed clusters of seedlings from indigenous plants to create a small functional ecosystem that can restore soil, protect resources like water and air quality, and act as a biodiversity hotspot that can have a measurable effect on both the local and regional environment, which is pretty cool. So now these are all spreading out through all of Europe, which is just awesome. So they pioneered a method of restoring indigenous forests on degraded or deforested land, which had been devoid of humus, and it came to known as the Miyawaki method. So this is using a formula that they created about 1,700 forests throughout Asia, 96.7 of which were developed in a resilient ecosystem within 10 years. So now this Miyawaki is now in Europe. So they're growing more than 10 times faster and possessing up to 20 times more biodiversity potential than contemporary forests. So the Miyawaki method is perfect for organizations like Urban Forest in France and Belgium and the Tiny Forest Initiative in Holland, with their strong desire to prevent the worst of climate change upon their nation's relatively small landmass. So there you go. If you start to travel to Europe, you might see some little forests that are going to help restore biodiversity. Pretty awesome. So now I will finally get to the survey I wanted to share with you today that I found online, and it just kind of brought me a little bit of hope. And this is what the survey says. People really do want to be kind to each other, even if it costs them something. And this is a new study that has revealed this. So some Americans may have kind of lost some hope for humanity amidst, the death of George Floyd and so many things that have been going on in the past year, or the past few months, I guess. But this new study reveals not all humanity is lost, and that most people really do want to be kind to each other. So researchers found that people overwhelmingly choose to be generous to others, even if it is at cost of themselves and regardless of external motives. So this was a study that was conducted online, and they asked participants to give money to other people, which then the team assumed would lead to subjects anticipating something in return for their generosity. But the experiment revealed volunteers were largely willing to hand strangers cash without any motivation behind it. Just the notion of helping the individual, and that was it. So they say we observe a help enough or do not help at all dynamic, with participants giving more when they had no reason to expect reciprocation from somebody than others who had previously helped them but not very much. So it says we observe a help enough or do not help at all dynamic with these participants giving more than what they had with no reason to accept anything in return from somebody than to others who had previously helped them but not very much. So this is all in the study. It's in the Scientific American that is conducted by teams at the Ohio State University and the University of South Carolina. So now the lead author of this study, his name is David Malamd, and he is the author and the associate professor of sociology at the Ohio State University. And he says we wanted to do an exhaustive study to see what the effects of those motivations would be when combined, because they are combined in the real world where people are making choices about how generous or how kind to be with one another. So him and his team invited more than 700 people to participate in this online study. And one is the idea that someone is inclined to do something nice for someone else with the motive of gaining something for themselves. The notion of you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, right? And then the second involves observing an act of kindness. And the third is a person doing good in the presence of people in their network who might reward their generosity. So the final motivator is a person likely to pay it forward to someone else if someone has done something nice for them. Makes sense, right? Most people have that motive, but these motivators have been studied in the past, and they have only been looked at individually or two at a time. So this is why him and his team decided to first investigate how all four interact and affect one another in a real world setting. So he says, in the real world, the conditions under which people are nice to each other are not isolated. People are embedded in their networks, and they're going about their daily lives and coming into contact with things that will affect their decisions. So these experiments show that all motivations work. If you want to maximize behavior, it was a really great thing to see. So for the study, it was all done online, like I said, but these participants had to decide how much of a 10-point endowment to give other people, and these points kind of shed monetary value. So there you go. So for example, a person may be less appointed to indirectly reward another's generosity toward a third person when he is focused on directly giving back help that he received. People have self-bias, is what he says. So if you do something nice for me, I may weigh that more than if I see you do something nice for someone else. But they've actually found that all motivators will show up as predictors of how much a person is willing to give to someone else, regardless of how the differing motivators are combined. So each volunteer was paid an endowment of 10 points for every decision they made in various scenarios designed to contain combinations of motivators to share their income. So this research helps us understand that the remarkable quantity and diversity of pro-social behavior we see in humans. That's what the author says. And he says, from an evolutionary perspective, it's kind of perplexing that it even exists because you're decreasing your own fitness on the behalf of others. And yet we see it in bees and ants and humans throughout all of nature. So thousands of Americans have now hit the streets over the past few weeks to protest the death of George Floyd. And most of them are doing so at the cost of themselves and the motivation of ending police brutality. So this study that they released basically just says that humanity is still here. People still want to do kind things, and people are still doing kind things. So I really just wanted to add that into today's episode because I think it's just a friendly reminder that people are still kind. There's still so many kind gestures happening in this world, and I'm here twice a week to fill you in on all the good things that are happening. So with all that being said, thank you so much for listening to GSMC, America's Still Beautiful podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Alyssa Jo. If you love hearing all of this positive, feel-good news and it makes you feel good, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button, to like and follow us on social media, and leave a 5-star review. This is the best part of my day. I so appreciate you being here, and I look forward to sharing more feel-good stories with you next time. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows. From the GSMC Podcast Network, from social media news to marketing news, and even weird news, the GSMC Podcast Network has you covered. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast.